Okay, good morning, folks. Good morning, good morning. I know, right? Little energy. Nice day outside. We're down by the lake. It's beautiful sunshine. We're at 9:15, so we're going to get things moving here. And on behalf of our Love Our Great Lakes Day leadership team, I have the privilege of welcoming you all today to the ANSE Corporate Center and to our event. My name is Tom Malata. I'm the Executive Director for Lakeshore Natural Resource Partnership. Again, joined in the room today by our event leadership team. And we want to get the ball rolling because we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers for you all this morning. And of course, a great afternoon of field site visits this afternoon. So I want to make sure that we afford as much time as we can to our presenters and of course for questions and answers at the end. Just a couple of things right off the bat. First and foremost, again, this is our fourth iteration of Love Our Great Lakes Day, and potentially the slides will, no go on the slides. Technology, right? Despite, right out of the gate, I want to offer a note of thanks to those who make this day possible. So beyond our leadership team and everybody behind the scenes, our financial sponsors, so Fund for Lake Michigan, a very generous partner in making today possible and affording us the opportunity all to gather. ANSE and Associates for lending use of this really beautiful space down here on Lake Michigan. Really grateful to be here in this space, and that's the generosity and the graciousness of the ANSE team. And additionally, a couple of core partners here. So again, I referenced LNRP, but the Ozaukee County Watershed Coalition and Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory. So really grateful to all of our partners, those who have provided financial support for the event and those who have been in kind in making today happen. So a couple of additional messages of thanks. One very fitting as I see a certain gentleman walk in the door. We wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the genius behind the scenes of Bill Morin. Bill, can I ask you to just do a little wave from the back, please, if you would? Thank you. We timed that really well, and we didn't even practice, so great entry. It's perfect. So back in 2018, Bill got the concept for Love Our Great Lakes Day here in Ozaukee County, more specifically Port Washington, rolling. And here we are in our fourth iteration today. And again, just a special note of thanks to Bill for really being the brainchild behind where we are all today gathering and celebrating Lake Michigan. Also want to thank, of course, our presenters for them taking the time on a Saturday morning to be with us. Again, I think just a fantastic group and really thrilled we have an opportunity for you all to join with them. So thank you to Bill and to Tim and to Melissa and to Susan Bentz, our environmental reporter from WWM, who will be our moderator today, and to all of our field site visit guides as well. So thank you one and all. Our partners, really, again, I mentioned early some of those core partners who have been part of making today happen, but we also have some partners who are represented out in the hallway. So please take some time before you depart the building today to take a look at some of the materials that they have put out. We've really got some fantastic land and water conservation partners here in Ozaukee County. We're so fortunate to have them, and many of them are represented here today. So thank you to those partners as well. And of course, to all of you, our participants, so good to have everybody back together. Last year, this event was virtual entirely in terms of the morning session. And then we gathered in the afternoon at some field site visits in Port Washington. So that was great, but it's really nice to have the hybrid opportunity to see so many faces here in the room, and of course to have the technology and the capability to have some folks still joining us this morning as well. But thank you for taking time from your day. We really do appreciate it. Two special notes of thanks here before we move on. One, I'm sure you may have seen today as you were coming into the building, you were greeted by Dr. LaToya Williams. So she reached out early on, and she is the elite Miss Earth Wisconsin. So she reached out early on and said, I'd really like to be a part of the day and to have an opportunity of welcoming people. Really nice of her to come Saturday morning and be here even before 8 o'clock, before any of us were here with coffee or goodies, ready with a smile to greet all of you. So I want to thank her for taking the time from today as well. And then lastly, we have a special thank you today that we thought was perfect. So I'll kind of ask, as I'm talking, maybe our Love Our Great Lakes Day event team can kind of start to mosey on up here because we have a little bit of a presentation and a surprise. Some of you may be aware of the fact that after 38 years, Andy Holschbach recently retired. So Andy was the longtime Ozaukee County Director of Land and Water Conservation. And suffice to say, really made an extraordinary impact over the course of his tenure and his professional career here in Ozaukee County. Somebody who I think certainly understands, again, through his profession, but really lives and breathes the dynamic of land and water conservation being intimately connected, who understands that effective water policy really starts with soil health. And Andy championed that message over the years, championed it so effectively, was instrumental in launching our Clean Farm Families program here in Ozaukee County, which is making a huge difference. And so we thought as a team, it was only, and of course you can see they're not meandering up here. So again, I'll say team, if you want to meander up here with me, I don't want to be the only one in the photo op with Andy, but we thought it was really fitting to invite Andy to join us today. Andy is now retired, as I mentioned, effective August 19th. And he let me know earlier this week that he was on grandchild duty. And I said, well, I think that's perfect. That's what you should be doing when you're quote unquote retired. So Andy was really gracious in joining us today, and actually I think brought one of his grandchildren. So it's a perfect generational handoff, and thankfully we have food. So that then helps, of course, as we all know, with kids as well. So I'd like to invite Andy Holschbach to come on up here. And what we're going to present to Andy, some of you may have seen the Ozaukee Press had a really wonderful editorial. And so that's what we've had printed for Andy here. This was several weeks ago. And the editorial title was "The Man Who Ennobled Dirt." Very fitting. And this was the picture, hopefully everybody can see, of Andy that was on the front page of the Ozaukee Press as well. So from the standpoint, again, of somebody who has made a profound difference here in Ozaukee County for 38 years, as we celebrate Lake Michigan and Love Our Great Lakes Day, perfect opportunity to bring Andy Holschbach forward and for all of us to join in certainly lending our appreciation or applause for all of this good work. So Andy. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Wow. So, get on. Jen, do you want to come up, Jill? Jen and Jill, do you want to come up for a photo? I'm bringing the rest of the Love Our Great Lake. No, you don't want the photo? All right. Well, all right. You want the little one in here?
Well, it's up.
All right,
it's up to Bill.
Yeah. You want to come on in here, bud? I'll get out because this is the handsome guy right here. So, yeah.
Turn this way.
So we got Bill, we have Jill, we have you. Sarah's not here, right? And Natalie. So.
I got to say a few things.
You do, I know, yeah, exactly. So, want to get in here by Grandpa?
Then turn this way.
There
Look
you
at
go.
everybody.
Yeah, right? It's all the. Bill,
You
you
gotta
come on
turn
over
this
here.
way.
Let you get in here.
Jeez.
Floor is yours.
First of all, thank you very much. I'll tell you what, it's been a real privilege for me to work for Ozaukee County for 37, 38 years. And you know, I stand here now, but I'll tell you what, I worked with so many wonderful people, and as you know, it's everybody truly working together to get something done. It's not just one person. So I have to give all the credit to people that I've had a chance to work with, the county board, my supervisors over the years, all of the farmers, the landowners, all my friends I've gotten to know. And like Tom had mentioned, soil health, you're here today to talk about water quality. If you're truly serious about improving water quality, I hope in every water quality conversation, soil health comes up. I grew up, and I won't be real long here, but I grew up on a dairy farm, and I've seen how soil can truly change if you take care of it properly. Soil is full of life, and you don't want to do tillage. You want to always have something green and growing. You want to keep it covered. You have to nurture the soil, and by doing that, water can actually, the soil biology changes, the structure changes, and water can actually get into the soil. You don't have all the runoff, and it's more profitable for the farmer. You're sequestering CO2, so you have the whole climatic benefit. It's a win-win-win. So on behalf of everybody I've had a chance to work with, thank you. And it's all about these young guys.
Thank you.
And thank you, Tom.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks, buddy. Thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it. All right, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we launch into our morning of speakers. First of all, we are hybrid today, so in person and virtual. The folks who are on Zoom will be muted. We have a number of microphones set up around the room. So for those of you who are in the room, know that if you are going back to get beverages or you're talking amongst yourselves, that may be picked up. If you want to have a sidebar conversation, we invite you, obviously, just go on out, if you would, please, to the hallway. Just because we are recording today, Nick Musan from Compass Video Creations has been kind enough to join us, and so we'll have a full recording of the event program that we can share out as well. So just be mindful of that. There are restrooms in the hallway, as you all know, coffee and other goodies in the back of the room. And the partner tables, again, please do take some time to share with our different partners before you depart today. Mentioned about the recording, and that includes also for our Zoom friends. So Zoom friends at home, if you do not want to have your image on screen as part of the recording, please do turn off your video. Chat room is being monitored, so we'll be bringing forward questions. The rest of you have index cards at the end of your row. So as questions come up, we invite you today to go ahead and jot that question down while it's top of mind. One of the members of our event team will collect those, and then at the end of our speaker presentations this morning, Susan is going to moderate a Q&A. And so again, please get those questions down while they're top of mind. And then again, field trip, the field site visits this afternoon, if you run into any questions, so you're lost, you don't quite know where to be or what time, feel free to call me on my mobile. So that is, and it might be up on the screen here momentarily, but I can share that out with you all. It will be.
Yeah.
So you'll see it, or I'm always happy to give it. So, but feel free to call. Just throw up smoke signals or whatever it might be, and we'll get you to where you need to go for our afternoon site visits. We've got a great morning of lineup, as I mentioned earlier. So appreciative. Melissa Scanlan was unable to be with us today, some COVID-related concerns, but was gracious enough to record a 30-minute presentation for you all. So in addition to Bill Davis and Tim Ellinger, we've got Melissa here with her presentation, and Susan joining us as she does each year as our event moderator. The afternoon guided site visits, I think you'll enjoy so much, so hopefully you're part of those. If you've not registered, don't worry about it. Talk to one of us from our event team, and we'll get you to one of those field sites this afternoon, because you're not going to want to miss that. Great chance to get a sense of some of the really exciting land and water conservation restoration projects going on here in the city of Port Washington.
We can put these up again at the end, maybe to see people off?
Yes,
with the
that's a
locations?
great idea.
That sounds good.
Great idea. Yep.
All right.
Perfect. So then lastly, before I introduce one final very special guest with us this morning, just kind of wanted to set the tone for you all today. I love this quote, so just some background on this. In 1903, then President Teddy Roosevelt actually traveled to the Grand Canyon. And this is actually after he spent 3 days camping with John Muir at Yosemite. So the life of a president was maybe a little different back in 1903. But President Roosevelt at that time had a message for folks who joined with him that day at the base of the Grand Canyon. And he was actually quoted as saying this: "Wildlife in its habitat cannot speak, so we must and we will." Such a great message, I think, as we join together today and we think about the kind of work we're collectively doing in the communities that we serve, and land and water, and of course the importance of policy, and then also driving policy through local community action. And we're seeing so much of that now through so many different environmental partners and through such great work being done in the communities in which we live. So it's a great chance for us to gather together today and acknowledge that, but also acknowledge the importance of that policy locally, state, national, being not only bipartisan, but hopefully us moving to some point when it concerns land and water conservation policy being nonpartisan. One of our local champions, and anytime you hear her on the radio, it's really inspiring to hear her really champion that, is Representative Deb Andraka. And Deb was grateful enough to join with us here today. I'd like to invite Deb to come forward and just share a few remarks, set the tone a bit here for us as we get moving into our speakers this morning, again, about the importance of water policy and then connecting that to local community action. Thank you so much for being with us, Representative Andraka.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. I am State Representative Deb Ondraka, relatively new, finishing up my first term, and I am really excited to be at something called Love Our Great Lakes Day. We really need a lot more love in Madison these days. Our public hearing should probably start our Love Our Public Schools Day, or Love Our Lakes, or our environment, because these issues that we're talking about is something that we should be able to come around as a community, and not something that is Republican, not something that is Democratic, something like the Great Lakes that we all rely on and that we cherish. So I have the distinction of representing one of the very few 50-50 districts in Wisconsin. Could talk about gerrymandering all day, but that's not what we're here to talk about. So what do my constituents contact me about? I have half Republicans and half Democrats. Well, in my first term, I have heard more about Knowles Nelson, preserving funding for Knowles Nelson, saving Cedar Gorge, and Lakeshore conservation, preserving the bluffs, preserving the beaches, preserving our lakes. And that speaks to why we're all here today, is that this is something we need to be looking at as a state and as a community, not whether it is a win for one party or the other. So that's the good news. The bad news is that when, shortly after I was elected, I did flip a district. It was a really tough campaign. I got a call about 2 days after Election Day, and they said, "You get to have a budget request." I said, "Hey, that's a thing, great." I learned a lot in my first term. And one of the things that I heard the most on the campaign trail was lakeshore erosion. So my district stretches right up and down Lake Michigan. So from Whitefish Bay all the way up to Port Washington. It's changed a little bit, but that was my district for the past 2 years. And when I would talk to constituents, they needed help because their house was getting closer and closer to the lake. We're having more storms. They don't know how to preserve their beach or their property. And so in talking with them and hearing that just on the campaign trail, even before I was elected, my first request to the governor was to establish a revolving loan fund, a $5 million revolving loan fund that municipalities and homeowners could use to help fund these very, very expensive projects to help preserve their lakeshore property. It made it into the governor's budget, and I said, yay! And then they tossed the entire budget out the window and said, oh, okay, I see how this is going to work. And so Representative Tip McGuire and I, we turned that into a bill. And so we had a bill to establish a $5 million revolving loan fund. Every time I went to talk to any of the municipalities in my district, they said, oh, thank God, because somebody needs to be looking at this from a holistic perspective. Because if one town or one property owner fixes their bluff, it doesn't do much good if all of the neighbors don't do it either. So I've been working a lot on that. We didn't get a hearing on that bill. But I am here to say we're going to keep working on it. I'm going to keep reaching out across the aisle. If I'm reelected, I never take anything for granted. One of the first things I'll be doing is talking to my Republican colleagues. How can we be talking about Lake Michigan issues as a community? How can we be addressing this? We have more severe storms. We have climate change. We have every year something is happening. We will be making sure that we are taking this on as an issue. I hope to make more progress than I did in my first term, but I learn more every single day. So I'm grateful to be here. Before I was elected, I was an elementary school teacher, and before that I worked for a group called the Environmental Law and Policy Center of the Midwest. So I have a background in working on issues like these. And I just want to thank all of you for the work that you do. You know, politicians, we show up and we say a few things and, you know, like to cut ribbons and, you know, have a photo op with the shovel. But everyone here, the scientists and the people who do this work day in and day out, you're the real champions. Spending, you know, more than 30 years working on soil conservation. When you're doing work, let our office know about it. I want to make sure that people know the work that's going on here so that all of my colleagues, Republican and Democrats, know that this is something that my constituents care about, everyone in the state cares about, and I hope to keep doing this work for a while. So thanks for the opportunity to say a few things, and I look forward to working with all of you. Thanks.
One more welcome. I'm Susan Bentz. I'm environmental reporter with Milwaukee Public Radio. I'm delighted to be here. I applaud all of you for being here, and I also applaud you for your work, because I believe that probably all of you in some way are involved in our Great Lake, in the soil, in everything that we're trying to do to keep this all going for coming generations. So thank you so much for being here. Melissa Scanlan, unfortunately, is not here. She's one of the wonders of our region. She's going to be talking to us virtually about water management and policy resources. But I can promise you it won't be as dry as that sounds. Melissa is the E-Line Endowed Chair at the Water Policy and Center and the director there. She also teaches at the School of Freshwater Sciences and at the university. She is the professor in the School, as I said, of Freshwater Sciences. It's affiliated and affiliated faculty at UW-Madison Law School. Melissa also is the co-lead consultant in launching the Center for Water Policy. So she was there at the beginning, which she started directing then in 2021. She has shaped public policy in areas ranging from the Great Lakes Compact and water supply issues to enforcement and implementation of the Clean Water Act and the public trust doctrine, which is fundamental to her being, which I think probably all of yours as well. During that time, her peers selected Melissa as Wisconsin's super lawyer's rising star for 3 consecutive years, 2006, 2007, and 2008. So she'll be joining us virtually, and we welcome her in spirit.
Everyone, it's great to be here. I'm Melissa Scanlan, and I am talking to you from the School of Freshwater Sciences at UW-Milwaukee. Today I'm going to be presenting to you on Wisconsin's public trust doctrine and how DNR water managers implement this doctrine. My findings are based on qualitative research interviews that I conducted as a unique time series project over the past, not 1, not 2, but 3 decades. It's hard to believe. The broad focus of this presentation is on how DNR water managers are exercising their trust authority to protect and manage navigable waters within the context of, let's say, shifting regulatory reforms and contradictory interpretations about the DNR's authority. So I'll give you an overview of the public trust doctrine. We'll talk about the 7 core concepts. Then we'll talk about how the DNR is implementing the doctrine and I'll introduce you to the DNR trustees. We will go into some of the institutional and statutory influences on their job, how they're enforcing the law, and political influences. And then I will talk about Act 21 and the impact of that on the DNR. So these 7 core concepts. First one to note about the public trust doctrine is that there are 3 parties and 3 entities here. We have the trustees, the beneficiaries, which includes all of us, and the trust property. And this is kind of like a financial trust, where you have these entities that are in relationship with one another. The DNR trustees are the ones who've been delegated by the legislature to protect public rights in navigable waters. And they have a supervisory duty that I would describe as something akin to adaptive management, meaning they have a duty to make decisions, look at the science of how those decisions are impacting our water resources, and then change and modify their decisions going forward in order to protect those water resources. Another aspect of this doctrine is that it is fluid, pun intended there, and that it changes over time to reflect our values and how we use water and how we appreciate it. The legislature is able to make grants of private lakebed title. Usually that is to a city or a county. It's limited, it's cabined within certain legal constraints, but that is something that the legislature has done historically. Another piece of this is that private riparian property use, so these are people who own property abutting the Great Lakes shoreline or other navigable waters, that use is connected to the public trust and in relationship with the public trust. So riparian property owners need to use their property in a way that doesn't encroach on public rights and navigable waters. And then lastly, active enforcement by the trustees and the beneficiaries is really important to having a healthy management system for our shared waters. And Wisconsin's Chapter 30, which partially codifies our public trust doctrine, characterizes every violation of that chapter as a public nuisance that any person can bring a legal action to stop. So that's important to know, that we have a role as beneficiaries of the trust. But we also want to look at how the DNR is enforcing the trust. So now I want to talk about my research. And this research really looks into implementing the doctrine by the DNR trustees. The legislature, as I mentioned, delegated authority to the DNR, and chapters 30 and 31 are the primary statutes, although there are many others that impact navigable waters. But these are the primary ones. And the people at the DNR who are carrying out the implementation of these statutes are called water management specialists. So I interviewed as many of them as were willing to interview with me in this latest round of interviews. And one of the more difficult aspects of being a water specialist that came out in the interviews is that they're constantly navigating this boundary between public and private property, and they're balancing this duty of protecting the waters of the state with the duty to manage and use access to the waters by many, many people. Throughout my interviews, I found a tension between the mission orientation that the DNR staff brought to protect the state's waters and the day-to-day reality they were facing. Almost all of them are educated in water resource management, and they're largely products of the UW system of universities. They bring a deep appreciation of the outdoors in their personal lives, and this is what draws them to work at the DNR and work in this job. But the reality can be a bit difficult. For example, many of the activities by riparians that impact the state's waters are now covered by general permits and exemptions. And this means there's less input on projects and less ability for the DNR water specialists to talk with landowners and guide them on how to minimize their impacts on the state's waters. In addition to a decline in individual permit reviews because the statutes have changed and these opportunities to educate landowners, the field staff are no longer typically involved with shaping agency policy. So they take a backseat to what many of them described as less experienced mid and upper level management who are making policy without understanding how it will work on the ground. These were concerns that were raised during the interviews. So I'm going to group some of the institutional influences that came out of the interviews into a couple of different categories that you see here on the screen. First of all, the Walker administration with Kathy Stepp as the secretary eliminated the division of water. And so the water staff are split up amongst the DNR and aren't all working together in the same division. They have faced chronic budget cuts and staff turnover for the water specialist position. And they expressed concerns about their supervisors not following the law. They also described to me a new approach to workload management called specialization, and I'll talk about what that is and how that affects them. But to give an example of how budget cuts and low staffing are affecting their ability to implement the public trust doctrine, a water specialist highlighted the glaring discrepancy between the number of DNR staff working on Great Lakes coastlines in Wisconsin, which was down to 4 people last year, versus 32 people working in the same areas in our neighboring state of Michigan. So in essence, water specialists are overworked, and one interviewee reported on his ever-increasing workload. One of the things he highlighted was that in 2014, he covered 19 counties. In 2018, he was responsible for 30 counties. And by 2021, he covered all of the state's 72 counties as the single full-time staff person in his specialty. So related to budget cuts and staff turnover is the issue of non-compliance with administrative rules by upper-level management. The supervisors are in a really tough situation. They are working in triage mode. And so they've set up systems where applicants can self-certify their compliance with general permits with little to no DNR review. And field staff raised a lot of concerns about this and that there's no statutory basis for self-certifying compliance, yet the supervisors are directing them to do this. And you can see why they've made that decision. And finally, I mentioned specialization, this approach to streamlining workload. So this happened a couple of years ago where teams were created by subject matter, and in theory, it allows staff to have a focus on a particular area, just on wetlands, just on habitat, just on enforcement, for instance. They work with colleagues who have a similar focus and become experts. The downside here is that the team will cover the entire state or a large portion of it, where previously one staffer was responsible for only a small part of the state but knew a lot of different areas of regulation. And this lack of geographic focus makes it really hard for the specialists to know who the local players are and to develop relationships. And many of the interviewees, especially if they had been at DNR for a longer period of time, so had experienced a different approach to their work, were pretty frustrated with specialization. Now I want to talk about legislative influences on the trustees. The staff face a lot of external challenges to their regulatory authority. And in the past 10 years, the DNR's authority has really been contracting. So I'll talk about shoreline zoning laws first. The legislature rewrote the state's shoreline zoning laws using a 2015 budget bill. And the new law, Act 55, drastically changed shoreline zoning, which controls the placement of structures and types of activities that are permitted in the coastal zone. As part of the budget bill, the law was passed without a public hearing or other processes that would have allowed for debate on the substance of the changes. And Act 55 essentially abandoned the prior minimum state standard approach to shoreline zoning in favor of restricting local governments to a statewide maximum uniform standard. So this is a major shift away from local control. And prior law recognized that there were different parts of the state that faced varying degrees of development pressure, and some local governments needed the ability to impose more restrictions on development to protect shared values. So in the northern counties, you saw that a lot, where there were local controls that were much stricter than the state standard. Now we have a state maximum standard, so counties and localities cannot go and be more stringent than the state. And the maximum setback now for construction is 75 feet from the ordinary high water mark. Any houses that are closer than 75 feet are considered non-conforming. And this budget bill changed how non-conforming structures are handled. Previously, some counties prohibited expansion of non-conforming structures, but Act 55 stripped the local government of this ability. And the practical impact of that is that, say you've got a 1950s cottage 10 feet from Lake Michigan, it now can be entirely rebuilt within the existing footprint and expanded upward 35 feet without ever going through county shoreline zoning approval. To further complicate this issue, the COVID-19 pandemic brought an enormous uptick to people who were fleeing urban areas to develop water adjacent properties and use public lands, especially in the Northern Lakes region. And the combination of loosened development controls for shoreline zoning and the rise in population continues to pose a detrimental threat to water resources. And the DNR's hands are really tied here by this legislative change. Wetlands, I'll talk about them briefly. In addition to revisions to shoreline zoning, wetland regulations have been revised to allow for more development, which invariably harms wetlands. And this is especially concerning with the rise of extreme weather, as wetlands are critical for absorbing heavy rainfalls and reducing flooding. So in Wisconsin, activities in wetlands are regulated based on three categories. They either fall into an exemption, they get a general permit, or there are individual permits that actually have more controls on them. And the DNR has seen a big rise in exemption requests. So under the new Wisconsin statutes, general exemptions are provided for filling or dredging certain non-federal wetlands and artificial wetlands. The unfortunate result is a substantial loss of wetlands that are no longer regulated by individual permits. And you may have heard in the past few weeks about the Sackett versus EPA case that's pending before the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court. That is going to define federal jurisdiction over wetlands. In the past, Wisconsin protected non-federal wetlands. So a case like that would have little practical impact here. But that's no longer the situation. If the U.S. Supreme Court narrows federal jurisdiction over wetlands, in Wisconsin, those non-federal wetlands will be allowed to have alterations and fit under exemptions from DNR review. Okay, I want to talk about enforcement here. So enforcing is critical to protecting Wisconsin's aquatic resources and public access. And the public trust doctrine enforcement process within DNR has undergone some significant changes in the past decade. For instance, under the specialization approach to workload management that I just discussed earlier, there's now a team dedicated entirely to compliance and enforcement. On the one hand, seems like a great idea because people can become very fluent in how to enforce the law. The problem right now is that the team consists of 3 people who are responsible for enforcement across the entire state. So they are also operating in triage mode. Complaints about potential violations of the state's water laws are received and prioritized by the trio, depending on potential impacts to the public trust, natural resources broadly, sensitive areas, human health, and property. And they are covering the entire state. So they are unable to build relationships with local people because they have to know people across the entire state. One of the enforcement and compliance team members described their experience here, and they talked about how they really emphasize voluntary compliance because it is something that takes less time to undertake rather than a formal enforcement action, which would go up through the administrative law judge and potentially into the courts. So I've got an example from the interviews about a wetlands enforcement action that one of the interviewees told me. In this situation that I was told about, a homeowner filled a wetland without a permit. It was part of a contiguous wetland complex that was more than 500 acres, this wetland complex. And the homeowner's property was 10 miles upstream from a municipality that had experienced 2 or 3 500-year storms in rapid succession, resulting in lots of flooding damage. Wetlands, of course, play a critical role in reducing flooding by absorbing excess rainfall. And this water specialist eventually won before an administrative law judge after a full contested case hearing. In order to do that, though, took a tremendous amount of staff resources. This person had to be on the stand for about 9 hours of the 4-day hearing. And in the end, the judge upheld the DNR's decision to deny the after-the-fact permit, and the DNR did secretary did support the staff. So it was a positive outcome, but it just takes a tremendous amount of resources to do that. And with a team of 3, they're going to be very careful about what cases they go through formal enforcement on. And this was, in fact, the first wetlands permit the DNR had denied in about 5 years. So next up, I want to talk about political influence on the trustees. And this is coming from a lot of different areas. Political influence can be exerted by legislators, by the governor, by special interest groups. And it has been present in every decade that I have done these interviews. So there's nothing new necessarily with political influence, but it has changed a bit in recent years. So one of the more direct and problematic examples of political influence faced by the water specialists is a threat of legislative change. So where a state legislator will say if the DNR doesn't take a particular action on a proposed project, they'll change the law. And these aren't empty threats. As I've outlined earlier, the law has changed quite a bit over the past 10 years to erode the DNR's authority. So the DNR knows that those threats can carry weight. Permit applicants themselves also have sometimes been able to influence water management through their relationships with high-ranking government officials. And water managers also face pressures from special interest groups, Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, who lobby on behalf of regulated entities to push for permit approvals, and also from environmental groups who argue the opposite. The water specialists reported internal pressure from upper-level management to approve permits with little to no review, even when a project clearly violates state water law. Now, this isn't happening frequently, but it is something that came up in the stories. One example that exemplifies this type of influence is the Kohler Golf Course case that is close to where you all are. So Kohler proposed to build a 274-acre golf course on the shores of Lake Michigan, and the proposed site is adjacent to the Kohler-Andre State Park. It includes rare and high-quality wetlands. And this was a situation where water specialists initially were refusing to issue the permit, but upper-level DNR managers overrode that decision. An environmental organization sued and successfully blocked the DNR from issuing this controversial wetland permit. And according to the administrative law judge overseeing the case, the Kohler company failed to submit definitive plans and complete documents, both of which are required for DNR to properly review a permit application and determine project impact. And instead, the judge reviewing the Kohler Company's application found only, quote, speculation and promises, end quote. So that was another situation where the courts had to step in to correct an action by the DNR. Finally, I want to mention the change from Governor Walker to Governor Evers greatly impacted the degree and kind of political pressure faced by water specialists. So under Governor Walker, water specialists who worked in that administration reported that the governor's office and state legislators routinely influenced DNR decisions, again, with threats of legislative change or executive overreach if DNR staff refused to cooperate. And the staff also reported feeling undermined by Secretary Stepp. With Governor Evers, the same has not been true. The water specialists reported that there's been no executive or legislative interference on specific projects, and they instead feel supported by Secretary Cole's office to make field level decisions. Now, I want to emphasize here that this is not a Democrat/Republican kind of difference, because in my prior research, there was documented political influence when Democratic Governor Doyle was in office. So this is really a difference with the Evers administration, and I wouldn't chalk it up to a political party thing. But it is interesting to note, this is the first time that I've done these interviews where the staff are not feeling that kind of pressure from the governor's office. Okay. Last up, I want to talk about the impact of Act 21 on DNR's public trust implementation. This is not an environmental or water piece of legislation, but this law was passed in 2011-2012 legislative session, and it was focused on shifting the balance of power from administrative agencies to the legislative and executive branches. And I'm going to highlight 4 key things that this law did. It prohibited agencies from enforcing requirements that are not expressly authorized by statute. The legislature needs to approve administrative rules. The administrative agencies like the DNR need to conduct economic impact analyses when they're proposing a change to a rule. And the governor needs to approve the rules at 2 different steps in the rulemaking process. So it's now much more difficult to create an administrative rule than it is to pass a statute in Wisconsin. In the past, that was really the inverse. Act 21 carved out a larger role for the political branches to control the agencies. And in practice, this new law really has impeded the DNR's ability to implement and fulfill their public trust duties. For instance, because updating administrative rules is so cumbersome, the DNR really failed to update any codes, any administrative rules for about 8 or 9 years during the Walker administration. Very rare to get any updates. And the staff simply didn't have the time or resources to go through what they've described as a convoluted process. The DNR water specialists are then left in a cloud of confusion about the reach of their authority to protect and manage the state's waters, because you have statutes and rules that are not agreeing with one another because the rules haven't been updated. And there have been conflicting interpretations of the DNR's water management authority from 2 attorney generals, which further complicated this, and it caused more uncertainty for the DNR, leading them to be more cautious and restrained as a trustee over the state's waters. Finally, a decade after the passage of Act 21, the Wisconsin Supreme Court interpreted its scope and applications of the public trust doctrine and ruled that the law did not undermine the DNR's longstanding trustee duty to protect the waters of the state. It clarified the DNR's proper exercise of authority to impose permit conditions to protect the state's waters, and that authority being explicit but broad, even if there aren't specific mentions of conditions that appear directly in the statute. So that's a long way of saying that now the DNR has some clarity from the Wisconsin Supreme Court that it can impose conditions on permits to protect the state's waters. But it's been a long time in the making, and there's been a lot of confusion leading up to this point. And I wouldn't say that this ruling answers all questions for the DNR. Okay, last up here, I want to talk about climate disrupted water cycles, and particularly how this is playing out on the Great Lakes. I'm sure this is all familiar to you guys about the fluctuations on the Great Lakes over in recent years. And the situation on the Great Lakes culminated with an emergency process that the DNR created to allow for homeowners to take actions to protect their properties. I have a video here that describes my research on this, and it's going to be a much quicker way. We are drawn to water to live, work, and play. For over a century, Wisconsin has reflected that importance in a body of law known as the Public Trust Doctrine. The doctrine establishes the state as a trustee over our shared rights to enjoy water resources. Yes, when it comes to water, every cheesehead is a trust fund kid. Throughout my career, I have studied how Wisconsin's water trustees at the Department of Natural Resources implement this doctrine, manage uncertainty, and confront complex challenges. Over the past decade, Wisconsin's legislature reduced the DNR's authority, made it much more difficult for the DNR to update administrative rules, loosened controls over building homes close to the water, and cut funding, resulting in fewer water managers to enforce water protection laws. Recent years have brought one wake-up call after another. During the COVID-19 pandemic, public demand for water resources dramatically increased. Meanwhile, climate change is bringing us greater extremes. Yet trustees are less able to respond when a crisis hits. Lake Michigan's water level dramatically went from a record low in 2013 to a record high in 2020. With buildings too close to the shore, the high water inundated some communities and eroded the ground beneath others. Hundreds of coastal landowners took action to armor the coast, often without permits. Inexperienced contractors came out of the woodwork and took advantage. Some property owners filled the lake bed to extend their property. Others added inappropriate materials such as building debris. Since DNR trustees lacked the staff and authority to respond in a timely manner, owners realized they could act first and get permission later. Some structures washed away in one storm. Now that the water is receding, shoreline armor is high and dry, an eyesore, a threat to fish and wildlife habitats, and an obstruction on the shoreline. To avoid similar problems in the future, Wisconsin and other coastal states should reconsider allowing homes close to shore or in flood-prone areas, invest in enough water managers to respond in times of crisis, and give them the legal tools to protect the common good. While the future is uncertain, the water always wins.
Thank you, Melissa. That was tremendous.